The qualification session is at Interlagos 75. The qualifying session is now underway. THR is P1 on standards. Pocket size is P2 on standards. Willian is P3 on standards. Pocket size is P1. Best lap is a 1:08.621. Pittman is P4 on standards. Simon Meisinger from Austria is P5 on standards. Waffles is P6 on standards. Pocket sized is P1. Best lap is a 0:52.311. Simon Meisinger is P5. Best lap is a 2:40.926. 1:48.615 behind the leader. Pocket sized is P1. Pocket sized is provisional pole with a 0:51.214. Ted Hoff is P7 on standards. Dalby 14 is P8 on standards. Ted Hoff is P6. Best lap is a 2:58.714. 2:07.500 behind the leader. Simon Meisinger is P2. Best lap is a 0:52.106. 0.892 behind the leader. Waffles is P9. Ted Hoff is P3. Best lap is a 0:52.228. 1.014 behind the leader. Ted Hoff is provisional pole with a 0:51.080. Ted Hoff is provisional pole with a 0:51.001. Dal V14 is P6. Best lap is a 0:52.537. 1.536 behind the leader. Waffles is P7. Best lap is a 0:52.676. 1.675 behind the leader. THR is P8. Best lap is a 0:52.951. 1.950 behind the leader. THR improved is P9 with a 0:52.898. Stefano Zanella is provisional pole with a 0:50.543. Stefano Zanella is P1 on standards. Best lap is a 0:50.543. Willian is P4. Best lap is a 0:51.359. 0.816 behind the leader. Hitman is P5. Best lap is a 0:51.898. 1.355 behind the leader. Willian is P4. Ted Hoff is P2. Best lap is a 0:51.001. 0.458 behind the leader. Ted Hoff is provisional pole with a 0:50.469. Stefano Zanella is provisional pole with a 0:50.205. Stefano Zanella is P1. Best lap is a 0:50.205. Ted Hoff is P2. Best lap is a 0:50.469. 0.264 behind the leader. Willian is P4. Simon Meisinger is P5. Best lap is a 0:51.864. 1.659 behind the leader. Stefano Zanella is provisional pole with a 0:50.170. Pittman is P6. Pittman improved is P5 with a 0:51.500. THR is P7. Best lap is a 0:51.900. 1.730 behind the leader. Pittman is P5. Best lap is a 0:51.500. 1.330 behind the leader. Willian is P4. Ted Hoff is P2. Ted Hoff improved is P2 with a 0:50.225. Pittman is P5. Ted Hoff is P2. Best lap is a 0:50.225. 0.055 behind the leader. Ted Hoff is provisional pole with a 0:50.055. Willian is P4. Simon Meisinger is P6. Best lap is a 0:51.708. 1.653 behind the leader. Duderay is P7. Dalby 14 is P8. Best lap is a 0:51.903. 1.848 behind the leader. Waffles is P9. Best lap is a 0:52.067. 2.012 behind the leader. Jerka S is P10 on standards. Ted Hoff is P1. Best lap is a 0:50.055. Stefano Zanella is P2. Best lap is a 0:50.170. 0.115 behind the leader. Pocket size is P3. Best lap is a 0:51.214. 1.159 behind the leader. Willian is P4. Duderay is P5. Best lap is a 0:51.458. 1.403 behind the leader. The race session is at Interlagos 75. TV crew 2 is P11 on hards. Pitman is P6 on standards. Dalby 14 is P8 on standards. TV crew 2 from United States is P11 on hards. Stefano Zanella is P2 on standards. TV crew 2 is P1. Ted Hoff is P2 on standards. Race start. Stefano Zanella is P1. Willian is P1 on standards. Ted Hoff is P1. Dalby 14 entering the pits is P10. Stefano Zanella is P2 0.1 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.3 seconds ahead of Stefano Zanella. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.3 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.7 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 3.0 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 3.1 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.7 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.9 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.9 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.1 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 1.7 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 1.5 seconds ahead of Pitman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.2 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 3.2 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 3.3 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 3.4 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 4.2 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 4.4 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2. 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 Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 1.4 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 on standards 0.6 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.3 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Jirka S entering the pits after 8 laps on standards is P9. Pittman is P2 0.2 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 0.5 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 0.6 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 0.7 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.2 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.4 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2. Duderay entering the pits after 9 laps on standards is P8. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2. Pocket Sized entering the pits after 10 laps on standards is P6. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2. 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 Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 4.7 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 4.8 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 4.8 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 2.4 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.4 seconds ahead of Willian. Jerka S entering the pits after 3 laps on standards is P8. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.8 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.8 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.7 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.8 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.6 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.6 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.5 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.0 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.8 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 0.4 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Willian is P2 0.1 seconds ahead of Pittman. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.5 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 4.9 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 3.2 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Waffles entering the pits after 14 laps on standards is P6. Pittman is P2 1.8 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.9 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.9 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.5 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.2 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.2 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 0.7 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.0 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.7 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 3.4 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 3.8 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 3.9 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.6 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.3 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.3 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.1 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 3.3 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.0 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 3.9 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.4 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.0 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 3.9 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.1 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.4 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.8 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.5 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.2 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.0 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.2 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.3 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Hitman is P2 4.7 seconds ahead of William. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 4.3 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 3.9 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 3.2 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 2.1 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 2.2 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 2.3 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 2.3 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2 1.9 seconds ahead of Willian. Ted Hoff is P1. The leader has just finished the race. Ted Hoff is P1. Simon Meisinger from Austria is P5. Waffles is P10. Pittman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Pocket sized is P6. Pittman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2. Duduray is P7. Dal B14 is P8. Jerka S is P9. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman is P2. Pittman is P2. Willian is P3. Ted Hoff is P1. Stefano Zanella is P4. Pittman is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. 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 Pocket sized is P6. Ted Hoff is P1. Pocket sized is P6. Ted Hoff is P1. Dal B14 is P7. Ted Hoff is P1. Dal B14 is P7. Ted Hoff is P1. Dal B14 is P7. Ted Hoff is P1. Waffles is P10. Ted Hoff is P1. The race session is at Interlagos 75. TV Crew 2 from United States is P11 on hards. TV Crew 2 is P11 on hards. DAL B14 is P7 on standards. Waffles is P5 on standards. Pocket Sized is P1 on standards. Waffles is P1. Jerka S is P3 on standards. Race start. Waffles is P1. DAL B14 is P2 on standards 4.8 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 4.8 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 4.9 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1. DAL B14 is P2 4.6 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 4.7 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 4.8 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1. DAL B14 is P2 4.6 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 4.7 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 3.3 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.8 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 2.4 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.5 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 2.9 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.7 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 2.1 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.1 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 2.0 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.0 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 1.7 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 1.7 seconds ahead of DAL B14. DAL B14 is P2 1.6 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 1.8 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 1.9 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 1.3 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.4 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 3.1 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 3.6 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.8 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.8 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 1.8 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.0 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.7 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.9 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.6 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.6 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.5 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.0 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.4 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.8 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.3 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 1.9 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 1.9 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 2.3 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 2.5 seconds ahead of Dal B14. Dal B14 is P2 3.4 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P2 0.1 seconds behind Dal B14. Dal B14 is P1 0.5 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P2 0.5 seconds behind Dal B14. Dal B14 is P1 0.4 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P2 0.1 seconds behind Dal B14. Dal B14 is P1 0.6 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P1 0.2 seconds ahead of Dal B14. THR is P2 on standards 0.8 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 0.6 seconds ahead of THR. THR is P2 0.2 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 0.9 seconds ahead of THR. THR is P2 0.2 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 0.5 seconds ahead of THR. THR is P2 0.9 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 0.6 seconds ahead of THR. THR is P2 0.3 seconds behind Waffles. Waffles is P1 0.5 seconds ahead of THR. THR is P1 0.1 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P2 1.1 seconds behind THR. THR is P1 1.5 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P2. THR is P1 2.6 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P2 1.7 seconds ahead of Pitman. THR is P1 3.3 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P2 1.9 seconds ahead of Pitman. THR is P1 3.5 seconds ahead of Waffles. Waffles is P2 2.5 seconds ahead of Pitman. THR is P1. Waffles is P2 1.1 seconds ahead of Pitman. THR is P1. Waffles is P2 0.6 seconds ahead of Pitman. THR is P1. Waffles is P2 1.1 seconds ahead of Pitman. THR is P1. Waffles is P2 0.1 seconds ahead of Pitman. THR is P1. Pocket size is P2 0.5 seconds ahead of Waffles. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2 1.4 seconds ahead of waffles. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2 1.9 seconds ahead of waffles. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2 1.9 seconds ahead of waffles. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2 4.6 seconds ahead of waffles. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2. Dal B14 entering the pits after 12 laps on standards is P7. Stefano Zanella entering the pits after 12 laps on standards is P8. THR is P1. Pocket-sized is P2. 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 THR is P1. Stefano Zanella entering the pits is P8. Waffles entering the pits after 14 laps on standards is P4. Pocket-sized is P2. THR is P1. 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 Pocket size is P2. 10 hop 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 is P1. Pocket sized is P2. Ted Hoff 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 is P1. Pocket sized is P2. The leader has just finished the race. Ted Hoff is P1. Ted Hoff is P1. Dal B14 is P8. Pocket sized is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Pocket sized is P2. Waffles is P6. Ted Hoff is P1. Pocket sized is P2. Pocket sized is P2. Pittman is P3. Ted Hoff is P1. Jerk S is P7. Willian is P4. Pocket sized is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Simon Meisinger from Austria is P5. Pocket sized is P2. Ted Hoff is P1. Pittman 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 is P1. Ted Hoff is P2. Pocket sized is P3. 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 Ted Hoff is P2. Pocket sized is P3.